I'm now going to cover composition rules and guidelines. So long before the days of photography, artists, those painters, analysed their images to determine which elements either enhanced or detracted from their appeal. And it was found that most of the truly impressive images followed at least one or two general image arrangement principles. Now these same successful principles can now be applied to photography, and these are generally known as the rules of composition, or more usefully they could be called the guidelines for composition. Along with the competency to use the camera correctly, like focusing and exposure, composition is probably of an equally high skill to attain, because unless an image is appealing, it will attract little success when viewed by others. For some people this composition skill is innate, but for others a set of basic guidelines can be of great help, especially at the start of your photography life. So I'm now going to run through some of the more important guidelines of composition. So what is composition? Composition refers to the way that the subject elements are arranged in an image. Composition includes all the elements in the photo, not just the primary subject. The human eye tends to prefer images that have a certain sense of order, while it tends to reject images that are chaotic. Simplicity of content: only include elements that add to the image's message, don't include stuff that causes distractions. And remember that when taking a photograph, the brain tends to filter out extraneous elements when viewing the live scene, but really notices these imperfections when viewed in a photograph. So what do you think of this image? Any ideas? It's nice, but I don't think it's all that engaging. It breaks some of the general principles of composition. Feels more balanced, interesting? Because I've moved the subject off to one side and up a little bit. I think that looks a little more appealing than the central slap bang in the middle of the frame. How about flipping the image so the bird is now coming from right to left rather than the left to right, which is the way the human eye tends to perceive things because of the way we write. Okay, so maybe that isn't quite as appealing as that, or maybe it adds a little bit of intrigue because of the way it's composed. But again, it's down to you. It's an art form. So the first rule of photography is there are no rules. However, the human brain tends to prefer images with a sense of order and structure. So some techniques, guidelines to help us achieve visually pleasing images. So any good photographer should try and imagine in the mind's eye the image that they're trying to capture before shooting. And then you need to position yourself in the move your tripod holds into a position that emphasizes the aspects of the image that you wish to capture. You need to change the focal length. Use the focal length of your lenses appropriately so that you can get the right balance of elements in the picture. Use perspective, juxtaposition of the picture elements, how they relate to each other, the sizes and things within the image. We need to consider aperture, depth of field, hyperfocal distance, which parts of the image are going to be pin sharp, which parts are going to be out of focus, to emphasize the main parts of the image. Shutter speed. Do we want to suggest movement? Do we want to make everything absolutely still? How do we want to interpret this image? Aspect ratio, format, orientation, the shape of the image. And we've got some rule of thirds. So this is a list of some of the rules that I'll be covering. Golden ratio, golden triangle and spirals, diagonals, leading lines, horizons, rule of odds, shapes, balancing elements, lighting, layering, simplicity, fill the frame, cropping, framing, leave enough space for the main subject, use of colour, contrast, texture, negative space. Backgrounds, foreground interest, depth. And of course, although you know all these rules or guidelines, there's always occasions when you may find it the need to break these rules, because sometimes that will work with certain subjects. But the general principle is some of these will really enhance your image most of the time. So, orientation, landscape or portrait. So for this image, a landscape or portrait. And of course you need to recompose the way you've taken the photograph depending on the orientation of the image that's going to be presented. Aspect ratio. So this is like straight out of the camera, 3:2. 3 across, 2 up. Okay. The HD format is 16 across by 9 upwards. Okay, that's the size relationship. And of course you'd need to recompose the image to fit that particular composition. Square. The old medium format cameras, 6x6, they always used to take a picture square like that. So you would become accustomed to composing your image for a square format like that. You can still do the same with your digital cameras. You just need to consider when you take it how you're going to crop your image to a square picture. Rule of thirds. This is probably one of the most basic ones. So the brain tends to prefer the center of interest to bisect one of the thirds of an image. Either here, 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 or here. The golden ratio. So whilst the rule of thirds divides your scene into equal thirds, the golden ratio divides your scene into sections of 1 to 1.618. That's quite precise, isn't it? And it works out approximately like this. Okay, so 3/8, 2/8, 3/8, 3/8, 2/8, 3/8. And your main subject should bisect one of these intersections. The golden section. This is a golden section rectangle. Okay, so we've got square, a square, a square, 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 and it eventually goes to the middle. Based on a very complex mathematical formula, but generally all you need to do is say, around about there. The golden spiral, if you've seen these golden spirals, they all come to the same point. Golden triangle. There's lots of gold in this photography. If your image has diagonals, try composing it using the golden triangles. So to do this, we go from corner to corner, then we bisect it by a 90-degree angle line going to the other corner, and then we put our subject of interest within that area there. Horizons. You need to get your, if there is a horizon there and it's important, you need to get that right. Otherwise the eye will notice that straight away and people won't appreciate your efforts. Rule of odds. They always say that an odd number, it tends to be more pleasing than an even number, and that tends to be quite a good rule of thumb there. Leaving space. Includes two similar ideas. So we need breathing room, so we've got a bit of space around the bird here so I can tell it's flying, and implied movement, so we can see the bird, we know how the bird works, and we can tell he's going to the left. Okay, so it feels better if there's some space for the bird to fly into rather than having a big gap at the back of him where he's been. We feel that it's a more balanced image if it's presented like that. Fill the frame. So the previous rule seems to contradict this rule. There's quite a lot of contradictions in these, but which states you should fill the frame with your subject. But of course, filling the frame is different to cramming unnecessary content into the image. So the fill the frame rule simply removes distracting extraneous elements. Simplicity. As a general rule, simple images tend to be more appealing than complicated ones. the eye can appreciate it quicker, I suppose. This image has minimal distracting elements. There's quite a lot of detail there, but it's all repetitive and it all leads to the same simple main subject. Leading lines and S-curves. The eye is drawn into the photo along converging or sweeping lines all the way down the valley. Patterns. Patterns can be very visually compelling because they suggest harmony and rhythm. Patterns are portraying a sense of order and peace, and patterns can become even more compelling when you break the rhythm. So when the eye is drawn to a slightly different part of, well, something that doesn't fit in with the pattern, and then it can go back to the harmonious pattern again. Image depth. Simulating image depth can be achieved through various effects, including depth of field. In this example, depth is achieved through the atmospheric effects as the contrast, and that decreases with the different layers within the picture. Backgrounds. Backgrounds can be intrusive, detracting from the main subject. Always check the background and use techniques to reduce its intrusion, such as changing your angle of view. Just move around a little bit to get rid of the big red blob or whatever. Focal length. Telephotos tend to emphasize this depth of field effect. Wide angles diminish it. And again, changing the aperture, depth of field it'll help prevent distraction because it'll blow the background out of focus. Lighting. You can emphasize a little bit of maybe flash on the bird to make that more dominant than a slightly darker background. Foregrounds. Foregrounds can help direct the eye to the main subject and give context. So here we have a highest point on the island and we can see all the surrounding areas. So it gives us a little bit of an idea of what's going on there. Framing. Now this is framing within the actual picture itself. And it can help isolate the subject from the rest of the image, leading the viewer's eyes straight through to the place where you want it to go. And these images have been given a key line. Okay, so this is very useful for when you're doing projected images. It helps isolate the image from the rest of the screen that the image is being projected onto. Perspective and viewpoint. Viewpoint can dramatically change the mood and feel of a photograph, and perspective can also change the viewer's perception of an object's size. So the viewpoint can change the size relationships between image elements, which we call juxtaposition. So by getting really down low here, we're starting to see this nice little pool effect here, which is quite large, but in the context of the whole image it was really small. Okay, but it's just by positioning yourself differently you can enhance various parts of the image in relation to others. Again, by getting really down low, the camera is virtually in the water, getting a slightly different viewpoint on the swan. Symmetry is one of the this is where it looks the same at both sides of the image, or relatively the same. Symmetrical designs are an excellent excuse for you to break the rule of thirds, and the more visual beautiful the subject is, the more appealing a symmetrical image will be. Another example of a symmetrical image, or almost. Texture. Texture is a way of creating dimension in a photograph. Diagonals. So strong diagonal lines can provide a sense of movement and speed and add drama to a composition. So we've got two different diagonals working with us here. Triangles. Triangles are a very strong visual shape. Triangles direct the eye from one point to the next within the image. And combined with diagonal lines, it can really enhance the image. There we go. Colour. So for some subjects, colour is one of the main appealing elements of the whole image. Without colour, this probably wouldn't, if it was black and white, it wouldn't have the appeal that it's got here. Conversely, contrast and shape. Monochrome is all about the reliance on contrast and shape and form. So those are the general guidelines. You may have other special ones of you that suit your own purposes, but at least by following some of these guidelines, either one or two of them within the same image, you should get a more consistent photographs, or at least ones that people appreciate.